Before we begin today's episode, just a reminder to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell if you enjoy this episode. Bethanie Dougherty awoke early on the morning of April 2nd, 2008. She made her way through her home, laying out her clothes for the day and getting a jump start on the dishes. However, before her son awoke at 6 a.m., she mysteriously vanished, leaving behind few clues. Several callers dialed 911 that night around 3 a.m. to report that they had heard the screams of a woman. While police came out and investigated, they weren't able to find the source of the commotion. Hours later, they learned that Bethanie was missing, and as it turned out, the screams had been heard less than 100 yards from her home. Police began putting the pieces together. They had an approximate time during which Bethanie may have been abducted, but little else to help them locate her. Massive searches were launched covering hundreds of acres surrounding Bethanie's home, but with each passing day, the case began growing colder. This is Trace Evidence, episode 127, The Disappearance of Bethanie Dougherty. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we examine the mysterious disappearance of Bethanie Dougherty. Before getting into the case, just a few notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focused on unsolved murders and disappearances. You can follow the show on social media on Twitter at TraceEvPod, Instagram at TraceEvidencePod, or by searching Facebook for Trace Evidence. The show is also available on MeWe and Minds. If you're interested in supporting the show and getting some Trace Evidence merch, there's a Patreon available at patreon.com/traceevidence, or you can donate via PayPal. Visit trace-evidence.com for all social media links, donation options, and contact information. You can submit case suggestions directly through the website or email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. Bethanie Dougherty said goodnight to her son and then went to bed to prepare to get up early. By the next morning, she had already vanished. This is episode 127, The Disappearance of Bethanie Dougherty. While the harsh cold of winter had begun letting up, the night air remained chilled enough to require, at a minimum, a light jacket to keep the cold from stinging the skin. Residents of Kilowog, a quiet hamlet in upstate New York, were mostly sleeping as the early morning hours approached, tucked into their warm beds and looking forward to the warmth the sun would bring, promising temperatures in the low 60s. However, at least for some, their quiet night was interrupted by loud screams that shook them from their beds. Sometime between 3 and 3:30 a.m., multiple residents in the area of Jennings Creek Road picked up their phones and dialed 911, reporting the distinct sounds of a female scream. Responding to the calls, New York State Police were dispatched to the area in an attempt to discover the origin of the screams. Unfortunately, there wasn't much for officers to go on. Units cruised through the area, shining lights into the wilderness and down barren streets, but they never saw anything to indicate what might have been going on. Radioing back to report no disturbances had been discovered, police went back to their usual routes. Approximately 3 hours later, just after 6 a.m., at least one person would discover the origin of those screams. The eldest son of 40-year-old Bethanie Dougherty had awakened to find the house empty. While Bethanie left for work early in the morning most days, this time her car was still sitting in the driveway, but Bethanie herself was nowhere to be found. Bethanie Lynn Curtis was born on August 10, 1967, to parents Avis and Terry. Bethanie had been described as an extremely kind, loving, and generous woman with an outgoing personality. Throughout her life, Bethanie had acquired 2 nicknames, with some calling her Beth, while others called her Buffy. For the majority of this episode, I'll be referring to her as Beth. While not a lot of details about Beth's past have ever been publicized, there have been an overwhelming amount of comments from friends, family, and coworkers which describe her as a fun-loving, exciting woman that everyone enjoyed being around. Avis described her daughter, telling the Press and Sun Bulletin she was, quote, a jovial, fun-loving, and compassionate but stubborn woman. She loved everybody and everything. She was just a wonderful person. End quote. Articles discussing Beth are jam-packed with similar descriptions. An article written in the Ithaca Journal interviewed several people who knew Beth, and they all described her as the type of person you'd be glad to know, with one saying, quote, she's just a nice, pleasant person to be around. She's a bubbly person and lights up the room when she walks in. End quote. Indeed, there doesn't appear to be anyone who had anything negative to say, and it seems apparent that Beth had a gift for making friends, as there are dozens of articles in which different friends describe not only their relationship with Beth, but how much they enjoyed her company. Heather Williams, a friend she made through a bowling league, went on to say, quote, she makes a strong impression on people. She's full of life. End quote. If there's one detail which cannot be overlooked, it's Beth's family. Beth had 3 children from her first marriage, Logan, Samantha, and Josh, and she loved them dearly. Beth's first marriage to Patrick McMahon didn't pan out, but she walked away with 3 beautiful children and still managed to strike a balance with her ex, making sure the kids never felt jammed in the middle or loved any less. According to Barb Stiles, a longtime friend of Beth's, after their separation, the two shared custody of the 2 youngest children, while the eldest, Logan, chose to live full-time with his mother. Beth would marry again, this time to a man named Bill Dougherty, but that marriage would hit the rocks after 8 years, and the separation, while not violent, did have some areas of contention, as you might imagine. Bill and Beth officially separated in November of 2007, a few months after Bill had made his intentions to file for divorce clear. Bill moved out of the home they shared along Jennings Creek Road, temporarily moving into his parents' home while Beth stayed behind. However, the home itself would become a source of contention between the two. In the early months of 2008, Beth and Bill were arguing about possession of the home, and ultimately their battle made its way into the courts. A judge ruled in Bill's favor, giving Beth until the end of the school year to vacate the premises, according to the Press and Sun Bulletin. That meant that by the beginning of April, the clock was ticking on how much longer Beth would be able to live in that home. While Beth had previously worked for a rehabilitation center, she had lost that job a year prior, and only in November had she found new work. She was hired on at the Extra Mart, a convenience store attached to a gas station along Dryden Road in Freeville, approximately a 30-minute drive away. While it was far from a dream job, it was work, and Beth was good at it. It didn't take long for Beth to show her skills, charming and befriending customers as they came in. Several coworkers later reported that Beth had a way of making the busy mornings a little easier, and she had some customers who enjoyed chatting with her so much that they would stop in throughout the day just to catch up. One of those was a man named Peter Shug, who told the Ithaca Journal, quote, she's a nice, outgoing person. It's a good job for her, end quote. Beth had quickly been brought into the management training program and was looking forward to earning some extra cash. If there was one downside to the job, it may have been the hours. Beth worked in the mornings, the busiest crush of customers commuting to work and stopping in along the way to grab a bottle of water, a pack of smokes, or a little snack for the road. Considering the 30-minute drive she had to make, Beth typically got up as early as 3 a.m. to prepare for her day, get some work done around the house, and then head off to work, where she would typically arrive just prior to 5 a.m. On the morning of April 2nd, 2008, though, Beth never made it to work, and what occurred endures as a dark mystery which continues to haunt the small town of Kilowog and its surrounding cities. Beth arrived for her early work shift as normal on the morning of Tuesday, April 1st. According to several coworkers, she seemed to be stressed out in the previous days. Coworker Debbie Seaman explained that while Beth seemed stressed out, it didn't appear to impact her ability to work or her warm personality. Seaman told the Sun and Press Bulletin that the stress appeared to have been coming from several different areas of her life. No doubt training for the management position and the situation revolving around her home played a role. However, Seaman also included that Beth had dated a few men in the months since her separation, and she was having some issues there. When asked about this, Beth's family acknowledged that she had dated a bit, but there was nothing serious. Seaman went on to explain that In an attempt to cut the tension down, she played an April Fool's joke on Beth that morning. Acting as seriously as possible, she approached the redheaded mother of 3 and explained that they were going to have to let her go, giving her 2 weeks' notice. Seaman wasn't able to keep up with the ruse and quickly began smirking, which tipped Beth off, and the two shared a laugh over the joke. While that seemed to cut the tension down a bit, putting Beth a little more at ease, Seaman expressed that there still seemed to be something bothering her. Beth would finish up her shift and head home at approximately 6 p.m., set to return to the store just under 12 hours later at 5 a.m. According to all information available, the rest of the day went along as planned. Beth went home where she relaxed, ran some errands, and picked up around the house. The last person to officially see Beth was her 18-year-old son, Logan. According to him, when he last saw his mother, she was home wearing her purple pajamas, getting ready for bed as she had to get up early, somewhere around 3 a.m. Logan hugged his mother goodnight, and the two exchanged I love yous. That would be the last time any of Beth's children would see her alive. Approximately 5 hours later, sometime between 3 and 3:30 a.m., multiple neighbors in the area called the police to report the sound of a woman screaming. According to Broome County Sheriff's Detective Matthew O'Brien, state troopers had been told that the screams seemed to be originating in an area several hundred feet from Beth's home. O'Brien explained to the Cortland Standard that this wasn't all that out of the ordinary. They had received similar calls in the past, and usually it equated to nothing. After state troopers checked the area and found nothing to report, police had little else to do. O'Brien went on to explain, quote, "If nothing's there, it's not like you respond out there, someone's missing." End quote. At approximately 6 a.m., Logan got up in the morning and began moving throughout the house. He didn't expect to see his mother. She would have left for work more than an hour earlier. However, the first indication that something weird was happening occurred when he walked past the dining room. Beth's clothes, which she had picked out for that day, were lying there, but Beth was nowhere to be found. Throughout the home, other items were present which shouldn't have been there, including Beth's purse, cigarettes, cell phone, and car keys. Beth's car was still parked in the driveway, and there was no indication of where she might have gone. Not aware that anything was wrong, Logan continued to get ready and made his way to school. It wasn't until later that afternoon when he arrived home that things began to seem bizarre. The home was in the same shape it had been when he left, other than the fact that there were multiple voicemails left on Beth's phone, and it continued to ring periodically. People had been trying to reach her all day, but no one had seen Beth since the previous day. At one point, Logan spoke with his uncle, Beth's half-brother, and when asked where his mother was, he explained what he had found. Concerned, Logan was told to immediately call his father and then the police. After police received the call, officers were dispatched to the home to take a look around, get a statement from Logan, and see what they could figure out. It didn't take long for investigators to determine that something was wrong, as examination of the house provided some disturbing clues. Firstly, absolutely nothing was missing from the home other than the purple pajamas that Beth was last seen wearing. It was noted that while there were no signs of a struggle inside the home, it suggested to investigators that Beth had either left of her own volition or perhaps had been outside at the time when she disappeared. As it turns out, Beth was a smoker, but she never smoked inside of her home. Regardless of the temperature or the weather, Beth would always go outside to have a smoke, and like most smokers, she tended to light up within minutes of getting up in the morning. Considering the absence of her pajamas, police began to theorize that Beth may have stepped out for a cigarette and someone might have been out there waiting for her. Dishes sat in the sink, some having been cleaned but others left untouched. Slowly, the circumstances began to emerge, and it was speculated that either Beth had gone out to smoke and then encountered someone, or perhaps was in the kitchen cleaning the dishes when that was interrupted, either by someone showing up or perhaps by Beth making the choice to finish the dishes after a cigarette. Either way, the strange disappearance began lining up with the calls from the previous night. The callers had noted that the screams had come from an area several hundred feet from Beth's home, which sat at the end of a long dirt driveway. When asked, Logan explained that he hadn't heard any screaming the night before, but he was also a deep sleeper. Based on information from the callers, it was considered that Beth could have been chased outside or possibly could have been taking a walk or was talking with someone, at which time an abduction took place. The distance between the screams and her home may have made it unlikely for Logan to hear anything, which furthered the belief that whatever had happened did not occur inside the home. Ultimately, the investigation into Beth's disappearance would involve both the Broome County Sheriff's Office and the New York State Police. A sheriff's deputy blocked off entry to Beth's driveway, while 3 large black vans from the New York State Police Forensic Unit drove down the dirt driveway and began going through the home and surrounding areas, taking photos and grabbing whatever they could find to help clue them in as to what may have happened. Police began canvassing the area, speaking with neighbors, as well as tracking down anyone who might have known Beth or had a reason to harm her. According to multiple newspaper sources, Beth's estranged husband Bill was looked at closely considering the legal situation regarding the home and the fact that they were divorcing, but he supplied authorities with an alibi which was solid. He would later participate in searches for Beth. While police were speaking with neighbors, they made sure to follow up closely with those who had reported hearing screams in the early morning hours, when it's believed Beth had likely been abducted. Remember, Beth usually awoke around 3 a.m., and those 911 calls came in between 3 and 3:30. It was during these follow-ups that police were given additional information. Reportedly, 2 witnesses had heard screams which lasted for approximately 1 minute. Upon hearing the screams, at least one witness looked out the window of their home and saw a strange scene. It appeared that there were 2 people involved in some kind of a struggle, approximately 80 yards from Beth's home. Though nothing specific was heard, or if something was, it's never been shared publicly, there was an additional detail which became the first major clue in the investigation. Both witnesses told police they had seen a mid to late 1990s Chevy S10 pickup truck of a dark color nearby to where the struggle was taking place. Authorities have never been able to confirm that this truck was directly involved with Beth's disappearance, though they have also never been able to locate it or its driver. Since 2008, police have been extremely eager to speak with the owner of that truck and determine what exactly was happening, but to this day neither the truck nor its driver have ever been found, and no one has ever come forward to report any information about the vehicle, the driver, or Beth. Police were quick to express that they weren't sure what they were dealing with and lacked solid evidence to confirm whether or not this was a crime. Sheriff's Detective Lieutenant Patrick Eisenberg later told the Ithaca Journal, quote, "Until we get some information telling us exactly what happened, we don't know exactly what our investigation is. It's primarily at this point a missing person case and still an attempt to find Bethany." End quote. Investigators and volunteers launched a massive search of the area in the days following Beth's disappearance. In the early days, the family was not allowed to participate, according to the Press and Sun Bulletin. More than 200 acres of wooded hills and challenging terrain surrounding Beth's home was poured over by searchers on foot as well as police helicopters. Police also employed tracking dogs to assist, but unfortunately, the recent weather made the search extremely challenging. Al Spohr of the Broome County search team explained the situation to the Press and Sun Bulletin, saying, quote, "Mother Nature was definitely working against us. The amount of precipitation in the last few weeks made footing unsure. It was slippery and some of the area was steep terrain. Some areas were actually packed with ice. The winter vegetation was simply bent over and quite slippery." End quote. Beyond the search in the area around the home, police and other searchers had spread out, covering more than 15 miles of surrounding roadways, though neither team was able to find anything which indicated where Beth had been. The search field continued expanding, with sheriff's deputies partnering with New York State Forest Rangers, sending boats into the Neoga River, which meets with Jennings Creek. Others were working their way along the banks of the river and the creek, but again, they couldn't find anything connected to Beth. As time passed, it slowly became more and more apparent that where Beth was, she was not in the area around her home, and the more time passed, the more investigators became convinced that she had not left of her own volition. It simply made no sense. Why would she run off but leave behind all of her worldly belongings, money, and her vehicle while wearing only pajamas in cold morning weather. It was looking more and more likely that there had to have been some level of foul play, which Beth's family already believed, not thinking for a second that she would have run off anywhere. In fact, Beth's father, Terry, started to believe that whatever had happened to his daughter had likely not been a random crime committed by a stranger. Terry told WICZ News, quote, "I know my daughter. Bethany would not have just gone outside for a stranger in the middle of the night. She knew the person that took her." End quote. Sadly, this was not the first time Beth's family had dealt with a tragic and difficult situation. 10 years earlier in 1998, Beth's cousin, Marla Green Ware, had been reported missing. Weeks later, her remains were found in her own apartment. Due to decomposition, detectives had been unable to determine her cause of death. While her death was ultimately considered suspicious, no one has ever been charged with her murder, and authorities have expressed that they consider it highly unlikely that there's any connection between Beth's disappearance and her cousin's death a decade earlier. The search for Bethany continued on for several days, with more volunteers joining in, but the weather continued to be a challenge, dropping a coating of snow. While they were not able to assist in the initial search, Beth's family did what they could in other ways. More than 600 missing persons flyers were produced and spread throughout the small hamlet and surrounding towns. As Beth's story began making the news, more and more locals began volunteering to assist with the searches. It seemed that in such a small area, many people had encountered Beth at one time or another, and many of them had hoped to help find the missing woman. As the weekend approached, it was becoming harder, though, to hang on to hope, with Beth's sister Yvonne telling the Press and Sun Bulletin, quote, "At this point, it looks pretty grim. I'm still hoping they find her alive, but I don't know." End quote. On Saturday, April 5th, police began expanding the perimeter of their search. Sheriff's Captain Michael Fetish explained, quote, "We will begin looking at some more secluded rural areas. Those areas will include some state forest and other wooded areas. If the weather's in our favor, we will put our boats in and check the shoreline on Upper Lisle and Dorchester Parks." End quote. In total, beyond state police and sheriff's deputies, more than 80 volunteers had joined in. Unfortunately, much as the previous days had shown, there was simply nothing in the wilderness around Beth's house which gave investigators any assistance in their investigation. No shred of clothing, no footsteps, nothing. In hopes of finding something, the Whitney Point Reservoir, approximately 3 miles from Beth's home, was also searched. Sheriff's deputies expressed that while the searches had turned up no information, they were also continuing their plan of going door to door speaking with neighbors in hopes that someone might have seen something. By the beginning of the next week, though, investigators began slowly scaling down the search for Beth. Volunteers were no longer requested, and the number of investigators involved was also being reduced, though they assured the press that every effort was still being made. Forest rangers in surrounding counties continued to search through areas including forests and lakes that might provide answers, and while police continued speaking with people from Beth's life, Captain Mike Fetish explained, quote, "There are a lot of interviews taking place right now, but that's all they are. Interviews. At this point, we still don't know what's going on." End quote. The FBI was eventually contacted out of their Albany field office, and Beth was added to their official kidnapped and missing persons website. Beth's family was nowhere near giving up and began to spread their flyer campaign. Flyers were handed out at a local festival that drew in thousands of attendees. Beyond that, they expanded to major cities, plastering Buffalo, Syracuse, and Utica with flyers and images of Beth. They also placed a number of flyers along Interstate 81 in neighboring Pennsylvania, according to the Press and Sun Bulletin. It was important to keep Beth's name and face in the public eye, and while police had begun turning down their searches, friends and family started ramping up their own, searching over where investigators had already been and anywhere else they could think of. Beth's father, Terry, later stated, quote, "We're trying to keep the awareness up, posting posters and talking to the press. We want to keep it on people's minds that if they do hear or see anything, to call." End quote. The family organized a vigil for Beth in hopes of building up more awareness at the end of the month, but unfortunately, Despite all efforts, the case was beginning to grow cold. In the beginning of May, a month after Beth had disappeared, friends and family joined with the Carol Sund Carrington Memorial Reward Foundation, offering up $8,800 for anyone with information regarding Beth's whereabouts. Beth's father made an emotional plea for information, saying in part, quote, "I'm asking the person or persons who took her to please look inside themselves and do the right thing." End quote. Sadly, no new information seemed to come through which could assist investigators or the family. As time passed, mentions of Beth's story began fading from the media. Nearly 4 months after she vanished in late July, the reward increased. A $10,000 reward was offered for information which could lead to the return of Beth's remains, while an additional $5,000 was available for information leading to an arrest. While it was slowly being accepted that Beth had likely been killed, investigators made it clear that they had no substantial information to confirm that one way or another. Broome County Sheriff's Detective Timothy Doyle spoke to the Press and Sun Bulletin, explaining the state of the case. Detective Doyle said, quote, "It's been a frustrating case. The leads haven't come up with anything strong. It's trailed off. That's why I've gone back through and started at the beginning." End quote. A month later, the Center for Missing Persons embarked on a cross-country tour to raise awareness of missing persons, and one stop would be just several miles from where Beth was last seen, hoping to draw more attention to her case. Still, while her family and investigators worked to keep her name and story alive, time continued passing, and soon a year went by with no developments, no answers, and no comfort for the family. On the anniversary of Beth's disappearance, a vigil was held at her former home. 2 more years would pass with nothing to show regarding Beth's whereabouts. At that time, Beth's father hired a private investigator, Michael Bidwell, to begin digging into the case on his own. Another 6 years would pass before there was much, if any, new information given regarding Beth's disappearance. In May of 2017, some 9 years after she had vanished, a dig operation took place at a property not far from where Beth had been last seen. Few details have been released regarding why police dug in the location that they did. Even the location itself seems to be unlisted. However, several articles acknowledge that while police surveyed a location and conducted a dig operation, no new evidence or anything connected to Beth was discovered at that time. In a 2018 edition of the Cortland Standard, both Bidwell and Sheriff's Detective Matthew O'Brien made cryptic statements regarding someone close to the case. Bidwell argued that a witness close to the case knew more than he or she was sharing with law enforcement, while O'Brien expressed his belief that there is absolutely someone with more information and it would be better for them to come forward rather than waiting for law enforcement to come knocking on their door. While Bidwell expressed his belief that the case would soon be solved, time has continued to pass, and there have been no further developments publicly acknowledged. It's been a difficult road to maneuver for Beth's family, many of whom continue to live in the area and can't help but look from time to time, hoping to find something. Beth's mother, Avis, unable to deal with the stress and pain, moved out of the state, relocating to Ohio. She later told the Cortland Standard, quote, "New York is just not where I want to be. I was looking for her all the time. It's like you get some hope, and then it's crushed out of you. It's even worse than knowing she's dead, because you just don't have any answers." End quote. When last seen, Bethany Lynn Dougherty was described as a Caucasian female with red hair and blue eyes, standing 5 feet 9 inches tall and weighing 160 pounds. Beth wears glasses or sometimes green-tinted contacts, but both were left behind at her home that morning. Beth has a gap between her teeth on the upper left side of her jaw. Both of her ears are pierced 5 times, and she has several tattoos, including a vine with flowers on her left ankle, a purple butterfly over tribal markings on her lower back, and 3 Asian symbols on her upper back. Beth was last seen in the vicinity of 554 Jennings Creek Road in the hamlet of Kilowog, New York, on April 1, 2008. She is believed to have disappeared between the hours of 11 p.m. and 3:30 a.m. A bright, kind and caring mother of three mysteriously vanished from her own home during a cold night. The only items missing were the very pajamas she was last seen wearing, and every other belonging was left behind, seemingly untouched. Her clothes, picked out for that day, were still lying where she left them, and outside of reports of a woman screaming and a dark-colored truck, few, if any, leads have been developed. While the hope was to find Beth alive and well, as now 12 years have passed, it's difficult for any to continue hoping for the best. For Beth's father, Terry, he clung to the hope that his daughter was still alive for as long as he could, later telling WICZ News, quote, "The pain is not acute anymore, it's chronic. I feel anger that whoever has done it has gotten away with it. That bothers me almost as much as her being gone." A mother of three vanishes in the middle of the night. Neighbors report hearing screams, seeing a struggle, and they note a truck in the area, but little, if anything else, is ever developed. For the majority of the investigation, police struggled to even prove that a crime had taken place, though eventually it was generally accepted that Beth was not the type to just run off. She surely wouldn't have abandoned her children, and she definitely wouldn't have left all of her belongings behind. She had every reason to stay. She was putting her life back together in the wake of her divorce, she was training to become a manager at work, and she was reconnecting with friends she had lost touch with over the years. Yet somehow, between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m., she mysteriously vanished. Disappearances are always difficult to look at. In some cases, it happened long ago, and a lot of what was initially known has changed or been lost. Maybe vital evidence wasn't treated with the care necessary to establish a perpetrator decades later. In others, it seems incredibly apparent what has occurred, but there's a lack of evidence or information, leaving things open-ended. Here, we have a case that's only 12 years old, and in the grand scheme of things, that isn't very old. I've covered several cases from the 70s, some spanning 40 years, some more, and the potential to solve them remains. In Beth's case, the biggest difficulty is the lack of evidence, yet, despite that, this is maybe one of the most solvable cases I've ever covered. When people examine this case, they generally look at it from one of two different perspectives. Either Beth was abducted by a complete stranger, or she was taken by someone she knew. There's really not a lot of debate beyond that, and there's plenty of directions that people point their fingers depending which perspective you take. There are those who argue that Beth must have been lured outside, or maybe that someone was outside waiting to take her when she had that morning cigarette break. Others believe that Beth recognized someone and walked toward them, at which point she was grabbed. The fact of the matter is, no one knows for sure, at least no one other than the person who actually committed this crime. We'll examine both angles of this, and I think we'll start with the possibility of a stranger abduction. Based on everything we know about Beth's morning routine, there's a good chance that at some point she would have gone outside to have that morning cigarette. Knowing now that all she was wearing were her purple pajamas and that she brought nothing else with her, that would surely make her susceptible to someone who was looking to abduct her. Now, when it comes to the possibility of a stranger, we've got to consider whether or not the abduction was random, and frankly, it seems apparent that it would have had to have been anything but random. Beth's home wasn't right on the main road. It was at the end of a long dirt driveway, and the creek itself cut through right at the front. It's unlikely someone was going to be driving by early in the morning and just happened to see Beth smoking a cigarette in the distance. Sure, that's possible, but it's highly unlikely. Maybe someone could have seen a light on, or maybe they turned down the driveway under the guise that they needed assistance or were lost and needed directions, but that's a hell of a gamble to make when you don't even know who lives in the house. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I sincerely doubt there's anything at all random about this crime. However, there is the possibility that this person could have been a stranger to Beth, or perhaps someone that she knew only on the periphery. We know that Beth had dated around a little bit in the months following her separation. It isn't all that difficult to imagine someone could have become jealous. Maybe they were interested in Beth but felt they didn't have a shot, or maybe they had approached her in the past and she wasn't interested. Beth worked at a convenience store, which in some places has been described as almost the social hub of that area. a place where people ran into one another, socialized, and caught up. Is it so difficult to imagine that one of those people who frequented the store could have developed an interest in the attractive redhead with a friendly, warm, and outgoing personality? Beth was extremely friendly, chatting up any customer she might be ringing up that day. Her personality was inviting. She had a way of drawing people to her. I don't think it's out of the question to imagine someone could have been drawn to her in a way that she did not reciprocate. Maybe that person got angry or jealous. Maybe they saw her out on a date one night and it pushed them over the edge. Again, there's really no way to psychoanalyze the suspect, but suffice it to say, if someone had been stalking Beth and following her, it wouldn't have been difficult to find out not only where she lived, but what her morning routine was. I suppose it ultimately becomes a question of how this person managed to grab Beth that cold morning. There's nothing to indicate a struggle inside the home. There's witness reports of Beth struggling with someone nearly 100 yards from her home. I've always found it curious about how she got there. Did someone catch her walking up and down her driveway, as some people do when they smoke? Or did they drive down in and run into her? I know I read one article where it speculated that Beth could have seen someone coming down her driveway and stepped outside to see what they wanted. But if that was the case, it seems strange she'd have done so in her pajamas with nothing else. There's the possibility that someone could have learned her routine and been waiting out there, expecting her to come out and smoke that morning. This person sees a light come on, and they know it's only a matter of time. Beth comes out, and a struggle ensues. Maybe that struggle extends over a couple of 100 feet, at which point the neighbors hear the screaming. Maybe this person tried to grab her and Beth ran, and eventually the assailant caught up to her hundreds of feet away. The fact of the matter is, all we know is that a struggle occurred away from the house, but we don't have any information as to how it got there. So much of this case is speculative. The lack of evidence makes it difficult to know anything for sure. So yes, I think someone could have stalked her and found a way to lure her out, or could possibly have been waiting for her. Remember, at 3 a.m., it's still pitch black outside. It wouldn't be difficult for someone to hide. It wouldn't be hard for someone who had just woken up to still be a little out of it and not notice someone hiding around a corner. I mean, who expects that? But there's also the possibility that this went down a completely different way. That the person who was ultimately responsible for Beth's disappearance may have actually known her, and it may have been that connection which made it easier to abduct her in the first place. If we begin looking at this from the perspective that Beth was taken by someone she knew, there are several different possibilities which have been presented over the years. Between ex-husbands, men she may have been seeing, co-workers, and others, there's a lot of different avenues. I did, though, quickly want to address one of those avenues. While Beth's case doesn't have a ton of forums discussing it, there's a few different places where people have gone back and forth about the evidence and theories. Across them, I found a lot of different people arguing about the last person to see Beth alive, her 18-year-old son. For some reason, people have decided he's a good possible suspect. In many of these arguments, it seems to revolve around the fact that while neighbors heard screaming in the middle of the night, he didn't. Well, knowing that this happened hundreds of feet from the home while he was asleep, that kind of makes sense to me. Some people sleep deep, and no sound is going to wake them up. But how often have you been awakened during the night by the sound of someone screaming for approximately 1 minute, several hundred feet from your home? To a degree, I understand people coming from this angle. I mean, you have to examine everything. But when you take it all into account, there's nothing that even remotely suggests her son's involvement. Police have never spoken about that, they've never considered it, and based on all interviews I've read with investigators, if anything, they've only ever suggested that this crime was perpetrated by someone outside of the home. I can't imagine what it's like to be in that situation, to lose your mother while simultaneously dealing with accusations from total strangers, but I feel a lot of sympathy for Logan. If there was ever any information or evidence to point that way, I'd be willing to accept the possibility. But the fact is, everything seems to point to someone else. Beth had 2 ex-husbands, one of whom she was in the middle of a legal dispute with. For many, their first thought was to go towards her most recent ex, Bill Dougherty, but there doesn't appear to be anything there to suggest the possibility. There was animosity, surely, but Bill had a solid alibi, and police have never considered him a person of interest. In terms of her first ex, Patrick, The two had managed to raise their children separately without incident, and Beth had been with Bill for 8 years, so it seems unlikely that Patrick was going to want some kind of revenge after all that time. It seemed quite apparent that the two had moved on from one another. In cases like this, you always have to look at the significant others and former partners, but again, this is a case where nothing seems to point in either of those directions. A lot of people have looked sideways at Bill, but according to Beth's family, while their relationship had its bad moments, there was no history of violence or threats. Bill had recently won a court proceeding which would force Beth out of the home, the one he was claiming ownership for. So why do anything? He'd already gotten exactly what he wanted. A lot of people have considered the possibility that someone Beth had been seeing, or maybe someone she had previously seen, showed up that morning. Maybe it was a matter of jealousy. Why aren't you seeing me anymore? Or I saw you out with so-and-so the other night. Maybe Beth anticipated an argument with this person and decided to walk down the driveway so as not to wake her son with a big argument in the house. It would seem apparent she didn't expect anyone to try and abduct her that morning. Others have argued that maybe it was someone she didn't think she had a problem with, someone who either stopped by once in a while early in the morning or someone she had previously made arrangements with. None of it makes a lot of sense to me. I don't expect anyone to show up at my house at 3 a.m. regardless of when I get up for work. If I did see someone pulling down my driveway that early, I'd assume something was wrong, that there was some kind of an emergency. Maybe that could have happened here. We really don't know what someone could have said or done to lure Beth away from her home that morning. At the same time, we have to consider other possibilities. Someone knocks on the door and Beth opens it, and that person has a gun or a knife. They tell her to step outside, and wanting to protect her child, she does. Maybe she fights back as the person's trying to shove her into their truck. It's extremely difficult to analyze something with so little information. The fact of the matter remains. There's certainly the possibility that Beth's disappearance could have been connected to someone she knew. While police have never discussed it, there's never been a mention of any phone calls coming into Beth's phone that morning. So whoever showed up either did so in a surprise or had previously arranged to do so. The truth is, we may never fully know. However, I tend to agree with Beth's father that it seems highly unlikely she was going to spend time talking to or allow someone to get close enough to her at that time if she didn't already know them and feel that she was safe. At the center of this mystery is a truck which has never been located. I'd imagine investigators dug in pretty deep, trying to figure out if Beth knew anyone who owned a vehicle like that. It appears that they've never been able to find anyone known to have had that vehicle, but then again, Beth was fairly private about her life. While her coworker said that she had been seeing some people and sometimes they stopped by work, they didn't know any names, nor did they know any details. Beth's family has said she was seeing some guys, but nothing serious enough to get a mention. That doesn't mean there couldn't have been someone who thought things were much more serious than Beth thought they were. So what do you think? What happened here? Was Beth grabbed by someone she knew? Was it some kind of a stalker situation, or is there the slightest possibility that it was all done at random? It's extremely difficult to find the logical thread here, and to a degree that makes me wonder about the illogical possibilities. Unfortunately, in a case like this, there's so little information publicly available that it's hard to know where to go, what to think, and where to look. The only thing we really know is that a beloved sister, daughter, and mother mysteriously vanished in the early morning hours, and 12 years later not a whole lot more is known. There's been some suggestion that someone close to the case could know more than they have shared, and there's the possibility that investigators have their eyes on someone but simply lack the evidence to file official charges. Sadly, without new information, a major break in the case, or an outright confession, the disappearance of Bethanie Dougherty remains open and unsolved and going cold. If you're looking for more information about the disappearance of Bethanie Dougherty, there are many websites and news articles discussing her case. The family once had a website specifically for Beth, but it appears to be inactive now. If you have any information about the disappearance of Bethanie Lynn Dougherty, please contact the Broome County Sheriff's Office at 607-778-0959. 1911. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, message me on Instagram at TraceEvidencePod, or comment in the Facebook group. I'd like to take a moment now to thank our amazing Patreon producers: Alicia Lorraine, Aurora K, Brittany Bivens, Brian Kemmerling, Christine Greco, Krista Colvin, D. Earthy, Diane Dyson, Eamon Brady, Guillerme Pinto, James, Jason Yeager, Jennifer Winkler, Joanne Berkowitz, Kate Much, Megan Cotter, Michael Graves, Nick Mohar Schurz, Pamela Coburn, Quinn McBreen, Roberta Jansen, Sarah Mascaritolo, Tara Doble, Travis Skepko, Stephanie Joyner, Stephanie Eve, Tom Archer, and Tracy Woods. You're all amazing, and your contributions are greatly appreciated, as are all patrons. If you're interested in supporting Trace Evidence, please visit patreon.com/traceevidence or visit trace-evidence.com for further information. I want to thank you all for taking the time to listen, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.